They leveled a settlement and broadcast it as a trophy. Humanity didn't respond. It sent a moon. The signal came from the Vrath Communion as a routine broadcast on all monitored frequencies. High Canon Sevath Drul's voice, flat, ancient, certain, came down through the relay stations like gravity. Settlement Kairos 7 is hereby reduced from the roster. This action constitutes standard territorial clarification. No further acknowledgement will be issued. The recording showed the settlement from orbit. Kairos 7 was a crescent-shaped research post built into the northern cliff face of a dead moon. It held 41,000 people, most were civilians. The recording showed them from the moment the Vrath suppression fleet broke Atmo, the first thermal blooms on the dust, the cascade of ordnance, the instruments cutting out one after another as the power grid failed, then silence. The broadcast lasted 14 minutes. The settlement was gone in 6. Dr. Yale Okafor watched the footage from her terminal in the secure briefing room. She did not look away. Her hands remained on the desk, palms flat. Commander Iris Venn stood at her shoulder, also silent. The video looped again. Kairos 7 dissolved under fire. The dust settled. The landscape returned to its dead moon geometry, bare regolith, a cold sun, no settlement. The file reference is 7-9, Venn said quietly. They catalogued it themselves before they released it, as if it were routine. Okafor did not respond. She pulled up the supplementary data from the Communion archives. The Vrath had released the entire suppression log, personnel counts, payload weights, engagement duration, everything. They had nothing to hide because they believed there was nothing humanity could do. The belief was buried in every line of their report, the way a dominant predator does not fear the mouse it has chosen to kill. High Canon Drul had appended a formal reclassification notice. It bore a bureaucratic seal dating back 6,200 years. The human species is hereby designated pre-emergent, no strategic capability assessed, no military response anticipated. This designation supersedes all prior contacts. Venn moved to the window. The briefing room was 3 levels below the surface of Anchor 9, the mining platform that hung dead on the perimeter of Frontier Grid Sector 9. Outside, the stars were sharp. Venn had the kind of face that did not easily show what she was thinking. Right now it showed nothing at all. "They're wrong about us," she said. "They are," Okafor said. "They will remain wrong. That's the foundation." Okafor turned from the terminal and looked at the data slate on her desk, the one that held no digital routing, no cloud storage, no connection to anything outside the room. It contained reference number 7-9 in raw file form, a list of names, 41,000 names, rows and rows of surnames and given names and service designations, the complete human roster of Kairos 7, now marked as historical data. The previous occupant of this position had printed them on actual polymer before the Vrath had even broadcast. A paper record of the dead, the most primitive storage medium imaginable, the kind of thing a pre-emergent species might use when they had no other choice. Okafor lifted the slate and began to read the first 1,000 names. That same moment, on the command spire of the Vrath Communion, High Canon Sevath Drul reviewed the operation logs for the 4th time. The suppression had proceeded exactly as predicted. The human settlement had not mounted a military response. There had been no evacuation signals, no distress calls to nearby stations, no futile gesture of defensive maneuvers. Instead, there was only silence, complete, absolute silence. The settlement died without raising a hand, and the surrounding human worlds, the ones Drul had identified during his tenure, had gone equally quiet. No appeals to higher authorities, no threats, no collective action. The silence was submission. Drul was 2,847 years old. He had suppressed 17 settlements across 12 subject species. He had refined the doctrine of preemptive reduction into a precision instrument. Species that did not develop faster than light military capability by a certain threshold of cultural maturity could be erased without consequence. Humanity had been assessed at pre-threshold since first contact. The suppression of Kairos 7 was not cruelty. It was resource management, it was the law. His tactical operations officer, Sub-Canon Verath, approached with the routine data compilation. "The asset survey is complete, sir. The frontier sector readings show standard infrastructure distributions. One decommissioned mass driver platform, Anchor 9, remains on the perimeter at minimal power. The signature matches all prior scans, non-military, negligible status." Drul reviewed the data without interest. The platform had been idle for decades. It was an old mining tool left over from the Communion's own resource extraction campaigns. The humans had inherited it when they claimed the sector. The survey systems marked it as inert. Drul filed the entry and moved on. There was no reason to look twice at a dead machine in the hands of a dead species. He issued the formal order. The settlement reduction was closed. The reclassification of humanity as pre-emergent was to be broadcast to all monitored frequencies and entered into the permanent bureaucratic record. The Communion's doctrine stood. The galaxy remained ordered. The suppression fleet was recalled to standard patrol routes. 9 years of absolute human silence would begin in that moment. The Vrath communion believed the quiet was grief and submission. They did not know it was the sound of precision calculation. In the hollow chambers beneath Anchor 9's external mining drill, Dr. Okafor turned to the teams that had already begun their work. 3 engineers, a kinetic systems specialist, 2 structural analysts, and the one person who had decided that answers could not be begged or bargained for, only built in silence in the dark, where negligible things could become inevitable. Project Keystone begins now, Okafor said. We have 9 years we use every day, and we speak to no one until the numbers are complete. The engineers looked at each other. They understood what she meant. The Vrath had a doctrine. Now humanity would have an answer to that doctrine. Not rage, not retaliation, not a proud declaration of what they intended to do. Just the sound of metal being shaped day after day in the place the Vrath had already marked as negligible. The first kinetic guidance rail was positioned at 600 on the second day of the project. No one outside Anchor 9 knew it was happening. They worked in the dark, not the absence of light. The station had power salvage generators running on a fuel cycle that would last the full 9 years, but the dark of absolute secrecy. No transmissions, no request for parts through official channels, no variance reports filed with the civilian authority network. Okafor had the authority to requisition equipment for station maintenance. She used it with precision. Every request matched a real structural need. Every shipment contained additional components buried inside legitimate salvage crates. The main mass driver mechanism had been abandoned for 15 years before the first human team ever set foot on Anchor 9. The mining platform had been designed to strip ore from the asteroid belt and accelerate it toward collection stations, a brutal, elegant tool of industrial extraction. The Vrath had built it, then they had moved on. The humans had inherited the shell and left it alone, treating it as historical architecture, a monument to what the Vrath could accomplish. Okafor kept the external drill assembly untouched. It was the decoy. It was also the frame that would hold the new work. Year 1, the teams installed primary kinetic guidance rails inside the hollow core. They worked in 12-hour cycles, fitting precision machine tungsten composite supports through gaps in the original mining structure. The metal sang in the silence when it was struck into place. Once a week, Okafor crossed the decompression corridor alone and listened to the sound. The rhythm of the work was a kind of prayer. Year 2 brought the targeting subroutine installation, the mathematics that would thread a payload through 3 million kilometers of vacuum and lodge it inside an engine manifold without deflection. It was air-gapped from all external systems. No wireless, no remote capability. Every calculation was written into the hardware itself, hard-coded into crystalline matrix logic arrays that could not be hacked, could not be observed, could not be overridden by any remote signal. Ven oversaw the calibration with the focus of someone who had built siege engines for a living before she chose to work for the civilian directorate. She held a physical blueprint under the station lights, paper, drawn by hand, and compared it against the physical mechanisms one section at a time. The blueprint never left her sight. The measurements never went into any database. The envelope is micron-perfect, she said to Okafor after 8 months of verification. The rail geometry holds. We can guide a kinetic projectile through a space the width of a human hair at that distance. Okafor nodded. She did not smile. Smiling was a waste of energy. Year 3, a Vrath long-range passive sensor array passed through Frontier Sector 9 on its routine patrol cycle. The automated scanning protocols swept across Anchor 9 and logged the same signature they had recorded for the past 2 decades. Decommissioned mining platform, minimal power draw, inert systems, no strategic value. The scanned data was filed in the Communion's archive. No alarm was raised. The platform remained marked as negligible. Year 4, they installed the first of the 14 kinetic impactors, 2-ton tungsten core projectiles, each one indexed to a specific Vrath military vessel. The hardpoints were sealed inside the main rail assembly, each one locked into a targeting vector that had been calculated, verified, and encoded into the guidance systems with mathematical certainty. 14 shots, 14 targets. The mathematics of the thing was ruthless. A second Vrath scan passed through the sector during month 7 of that year. The signature remained unchanged. No power increase was detected. The platform was still negligible. Year 5, Okafor sat at her desk terminal and reviewed the list of names again. She did this once per month, every month, without exception. She would open the file on the unconnected slate and read through them in alphabetical order. The names of the 41,000, the names of the weight she carried. She had been 17 when she first enlisted in the civilian directorate, young enough to believe that precision engineering could solve problems that precision engineering could not actually solve. That was 23 years ago. She was still 17 in the way that mattered. The only thing that had changed was what she was willing to build. By year 6, the targeting subroutines had been tested and verified 17 times. The kinetic rail systems had been stress cycled to failure and rebuilt to tolerance. The impactors were locked in their hardpoints, each one oriented toward its assigned target. Ven moved through the station in those final months with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had built something that would not fail. The third automated Vrath scan occurred in month 3 of year 7. It found exactly what it had found before: a dead platform, minimal power, no threat assessment necessary. The file was archived. Humanity remained categorized as pre-emergent. The fourth scan came late in year 8. By then the station was at 96% completion. The only work remaining was the final capacitor charge cycle and the indexing lock for the mass driver firing mechanism. Everything else was ready. The scan returned the same result: negligible, inert, of no consequence whatsoever. Okafor felt the weight of it in those final months, not the weight of doubt, but the weight of absolute certainty that what they had built would work. The Vrath Communion had 5,000 years of doctrinal consistency. They believed in the mathematics of dominance, the hierarchy that could not be broken by anything smaller than itself. They had calculated humanity's place in that hierarchy and filed it away. What they had not calculated was what happened when a species that had been marked as negligible built something anyway. Not in rage, not in desperation, just in the mathematics of response. On the morning of the 9th anniversary of Kairos 7's erasure, Dr. Yale Okafor entered the station's main control room for the first time since the project began. The screens were dark. She activated them in sequence. The capacitor banks lit up green, yellow, amber, building toward full charge. The kinetic guidance systems came online. The targeting arrays locked into their final configuration. Ven was already there, standing in the shadows at the rear of the chamber, watching the readouts climb. "All 14 are synchronized," Ven said. "They're ready." Okafor placed her hand on the primary charge control. The metal was cold. She did not move for a long moment. In that silence she could hear the sound of the engineers from 9 years ago striking metal into place. She could hear the precision of it. She could hear the prayer. "Not yet," she said, "but soon." Across the void, on the command spire of the Vrath Communion, High Canon Drool moved through his daily administrative duties with the serene confidence of a man who had never been surprised by anything smaller than a star. The Kairos 7 suppression had been closed. The human species had been reclassified. The file was secure. The hierarchy remained unbroken. He did not know that the negligible species had spent 9 years turning one of his own decommissioned tools into the instrument of his certainty's death. He did not know that, in a sector he had deemed too empty to warrant garrison stations, the mathematics of response had been waiting. The morning of the 9th anniversary at 400 Communion Standard Time, Anchor 9's capacitor banks began their final discharge cycle. No alarm sounded in the control room. Ven and Okafor had disabled all audible alerts years ago. The only sound was the whisper of the systems settling into their last configuration, power flowing through the hardened guidance channels, the kinetic impactors locking into their terminal vectors, the mathematics of 9 years of work condensing into a single moment of absolute certainty. Okafor's hands remained still. She had not slept. There was no need to sleep anymore. The targeting array confirmed the lock sequence: 14 hardpoints, 14 separated vessels in the Vrath command structure, each one positioned at the coordinates that Ven's original calculations had predicted 9 years ago. The movement through empty space had been minimal. The Vrath liked patterns. The Vrath liked predictability. The Vrath liked the comfort of knowing that everything smaller than themselves would remain smaller. At 4:03, the mass driver fired its first kinetic payload. The tungsten core impactor, 2 tons of compressed precision, cleared the magnetic acceleration rails at 0.3 light seconds and began its silent transit through the void. There was no propulsion system. There was no way to course correct. The only certainty was the mathematics that Ven had built into its trajectory, and the certainty was absolute. 47 minutes later, the Kethvar station logistics depot ceased to exist. The impactor punched through the engine manifold at the exact angle Ven had calculated. The fuel lines ignited in a cascade that consumed the station in 11 seconds. A cloud of debris, superheated and expanding, bloomed across the sensor arrays of every Vrath vessel in the sector. The fuel reserves of the suppression fleet dropped from full to 34% operational capacity. A third of their ability to maintain station, to reach targets, to execute doctrine, had been erased by something they had marked as negligible. On the command spire, Subcanon Verath was the first to notice the anomaly. His interface showed the depot telemetry cutting to static, then resuming with the fatal readout. The station no longer existed. He stared at the display for 7 seconds before his training overrode his shock. He pulled the sector threat assessment. Nothing, no hostile fleet signatures, no energy weapons discharge, just the debris field expanding where Kethvar had been. Then he looked at the trajectory analysis. The impact vector pointed back into Frontier Sector 9. His hands moved across the tactical console, pulling up the historical asset registry. Anchor 9, decommissioned mining platform. The last scan showed it inert, minimal power, no strategic value. But the mathematics did not lie. The impactor had originated from that vector. It had come from the negligible platform that had been marked as inert for 40 communion years. Verath's hands were trembling when he opened the direct channel to High Cannon Drool's quarters. Drool had been reviewing administrative reports when the transmission came through. His morning was proceeding as all his mornings did, the quiet satisfaction of systems running as designed, the hierarchy maintained, the species kept in their assigned places. The briefing about the depot was delivered with clinical precision by Verath, who was using his commander's voice but sounding like someone reporting the dissolution of a law. Drool moved to the primary display. The debris field was real. The energy readings confirmed it. The Kethvar depot, 20 years old, supply nexus for the Western Patrol grid, repository of 3 million liters of processed fuel, had been eliminated by an object of unknown origin. He pulled up the trajectory analysis himself. His eyes followed the geometry, the angles, the point of origin, Anchor 9. For the first time in 2,847 years, High Cannon Sevath Drool felt something that his doctrine did not have a word for. It was not fear. Fear was an emotion for prey animals. It was the moment when a pattern that had held perfect for 6,000 years showed a fissure, and behind the fissure was something moving with intention. He checked the historical files. The platform had been logged as negligible in the last 4 scans. Negligible. He had personally filed that assessment. He had moved on with the certainty that nothing smaller than his doctrine could challenge it. He was wrong. The realization was not shock, it was worse. It was the cold mathematics of recalibration. If humanity had been patient enough to build something for 9 years without detection, then humanity was not what the doctrine had assessed. If they had been precise enough to calculate a trajectory through 3 million kilometers of vacuum and score a direct hit on a military installation, then their engineering capability was not negligible. If they had restrained themselves to a single shot, then they had either run out of capability, which was possible, or they had chosen restraint. Drool looked at the remaining fleet strength. 34% of his operational capacity had been erased. He had no incoming threat warnings. He had no evidence of a second strike coming, but the absence of evidence was no longer the presence of assurance. Then his communication system intercepted an unscheduled transmission, routing directly into his command array. The source was Anchor 9. The destination was his private channel. A voice came through, female, calm, entirely devoid of triumph or threat. It was the voice of someone reading a set of facts into the record. High Cannon Drool, this transmission is Dr. Yale Okafor, Director of the Salvage Engineering Directorate. Anchor 9 has 13 remaining kinetic impactors indexed to your current fleet positions. This offer is non-negotiable and non-renewable. You have 72 hours to meet 3 terms. First, withdrawal of all Vrath forces from the Kairos sector and establishment of Frontier Grid Sector 9 as independent human territory. Second, recognition of humanity under the Compact as a sovereign species, effective retroactive to the original contact date. Third, the unedited broadcast of the footage from Kairos 7, alongside a complete list of the 41,000 dead, distributed to all monitored frequencies and entered into permanent communion record. The voice paused. There was no threat in the silence. That was the worst part. You have 72 hours to comply. We have been patient. We remain patient. That should concern you more than the depot did. The transmission ended. The channel closed. Drool stood in absolute silence, his command spire around him, the debris field still expanding on his displays, and understood with the certainty of mathematical proof that humanity had been playing a much longer game than the doctrine had ever suspected. The 48 hours passed the way administrative periods always did, in increments, logged without commentary. At hour 11, the Sovereignty's Commerce Council submitted a formal notification of territorial demand withdrawal to the Outer Rim Observer Relay. The language was procedural. It cited operational reconsideration and did not explain further. No one at the Council asked it to. At hour 31, the transport convoy departed Relay Station Dho Anara on the coordinate grid OSA had transmitted. 19 ships, the same ones that had answered the false distress call, now carrying every person the Sovereignty had processed into sub-tier intake. Their transponders broadcast civilian registry codes. Their drives ran at passenger-grade speed. They were slow and trusting, and they arrived at the border waypoint at hour 46 without incident. The youngest name on the roster, a child who had been 9 years old when the ultimatum was filed, was asleep when the transport crossed the threshold. Her parents were not. They stood in the corridor outside the cabin door and did not speak. There was nothing that needed saying at that particular moment, and the corridor was the kind of corridor where silence felt correct. Kato Ren logged the convoy's arrival at 04:38 local time, Accra. He made the entry by hand, in the same font the office used for cargo confirmation. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. Osai was already drafting the dormancy signal when he turned back to his console. She had the handwritten document open beside her, 4 words, 3 of them already struck through, and she was writing the transmission by hand before typing it, the way she wrote everything that mattered. Same frequency? Ren asked. Same frequency, she said. Same cargo status phrasing, the system will recognize it. The word she used was not Stillwater. The dormancy signal was a different phrase, one chosen in Year 3 for Year 9 on the assumption that the dormancy would be the part that required the most precision. Stillwater had been the activation. This was something else, a word that meant, in the freight lexicon of 40,000 operators who would never know it, carried 2 meanings: shipment complete, no further action required. She typed it, she sent it. On Ren's display, the 214 green markers did not turn grey. They did not change color at all. They stayed green because the nodes were still there, still embedded in the routing layer of every relay station in the Sovereignty's jump network, still running their diagnostic loops, still passing every audit they would ever be asked to pass. Dormancy was not removal. Osa had been precise about that in the terms, and she had been precise about it deliberately. You will never know which stations still carry it. The markers sat at 214. Ren looked at them for a long time. In the weeks that followed, the Commerce Council convened 3 working sessions on what its members were calling, in formal session language, the Navigational Infrastructure Incident. The term had been agreed upon in the first session, after 2 hours of discussion about what to call something that had no precedent in 3 centuries of sovereignty operation. The third session produced a draft protocol for rescue vessel identification, a formal mechanism, 3 articles long, that would theoretically prevent a distress beacon from being used as a lure for civilian transport ships. The draft was submitted to the Outerim Observer Registry for comment. Earth's Observer delegation read it and sent back a 1-paragraph acknowledgement. The paragraph noted receipt, confirmed the delegation's availability for further discussion, and thanked the Council for its attention to the matter. It did not say anything else. The delegation did not ask for the draft to be strengthened. They did not ask for enforcement provisions. They did not ask for anything. This was noted by every species represented in that session, and discussed afterward in at least 9 separate closed briefings, and written into 4 separate intelligence summaries for 4 separate governments. The summaries used different language but reached the same conclusion, that a species which had spent 9 years building something it never needed to mention, and then used it once and said nothing further, was a species that had communicated everything it needed to communicate. Varath On was relieved of his command 22 days after the conv crossed the border. The official records cited operational assessment. He returned to his home system and was not given a new posting. He took the physical treaty document with him. He was permitted to do this because it was his personal copy. He had purchased it from the archive 20 years ago at the start of his career, because he believed a supreme legate should hold the source material in his hands. He kept it in his office at home, in a desk drawer that he did not open for a long time. When he finally did, he did not open it to page 22. The logistics office below the cargo hub in Accra stayed exactly as it was. The floor remained unfinished concrete. The overhead panel above the coffee machine continued its intermittent flicker. The coffee machine itself was not repaired. No replacement request was filed, because filing a replacement request would have meant formally documenting that the office existed, and that policy had been in place for 9 years and was not revised. Osai filed 1 document in the final administrative period, a routine waypoint maintenance confirmation, submitted through a shell company that had been dissolved 7 years ago and existed now only as a routing identifier in a freight network that no one except Ren had ever fully mapped. The document confirmed that 312 commercial waypoints remained active and current. Maintenance cycle, ongoing, status, standard. It was the most accurate thing she had filed in 9 years. She drew a line through the 4th word in the handwritten document. Done. She closed it and put it in the desk drawer. Then she picked up her mug, found it still empty from the night before, and set it back down with the same precision she used for everything. Ren had pulled up a new routing manifest on his console. He was already reading it. The 214 green markers sat in their column on the display, unchanged, unhurried. The way something sits when it has no reason to move and no interest in announcing that it isn't moving. They would sit there tomorrow. They would sit there next year. They would pass the next audit and the one after that, running their diagnostic loops in the same relay stations that had rejected sovereignty credentials on a Tuesday morning, and then simply continue to operate. Nobody who answered a distress call in the outer rim after that ever answered one alone. The record showed it 343 calls, and then 344, the number climbing with the same patience the green markers maintained. Each one answered, each one logged. Not sentiment, not habit. They answered the distress call because they were already in a position to do so. The distress call was not the vulnerability. The distress call was the invitation.